My name is Glenn Gaubrey, and I'm the founder and president of the Ecological Research and Development Group, or ERDG. Today's presentation is intended to dispel some misinformation that is in circulation about the harvest of the Asian horseshoe crab for the production of an endotoxin test called TAL, used by the pharmaceutical biomedical industry operating primarily in China, and the detrimental impact this harvest is having on 2 of the 3 Asian horseshoe crab species. It is our hope that once aware of this unsustainable harvest, the pharmaceutical biomedical industry will make adjustments to their endotoxin test supply line, thereby becoming our partners in the conservation of this remarkable mariner. For those of you who are not familiar with ERDG, we are a 501c3 nonprofit wildlife conservation organization founded in 1995. Whose primary focus is the conservation of the world's 4 horseshoe crab species. We accomplish our mission through the synergy between our community building initiatives and the Horseshoe Crab Conservation Network, which we created in 2006 to connect like-minded individuals, communities, scientists, NGOs, corporations, and governmental agencies around the world behind the conservation of the world's 4 horseshoe crab species. At the core of ERDG's conservation philosophy lies the belief that sustainable conservation can only be achieved when we place the value of life above self-interest. Over the years, we have developed a host of community-building initiatives designed to encourage a sense of stewardship towards the horseshoe crab species at the very least and compassion for them at the very best. I would like to think that we have made a difference, but so have many other individuals and groups around the world. To that point, I would like to spend just a moment to acknowledge the collective work of the global horseshoe crab conservation community, whose selfless effort over countless years have begun to change the tide of ignorance and indifference that has surrounded this remarkable mariner for most of its recorded history. I would particularly like to thank our senior conservation pioneers, like Dr. Carl N. Schuster Jr., Keiji Tsuchiya, and the late Dr. Koichi Sakaguchi, whose vision and dedication to the understanding and conservation of the world's 4 horseshoe crab species paved the way for others to follow. In 2009, ERDG started its Protecting Health initiative, designed to both inform the public about the role horseshoe crabs play in protecting human and animal health, and to engage the pharmaceutical biomedical industry in its conservation by purchasing their endotoxin testing materials from producers that use sustainable harvesting practices and/or reduce the reliance on this natural resource through the use of alternative endotoxin testing methods, of which there are several. Humans and animals can become sick if exposed to bacterial endotoxin. It is especially dangerous if endotoxin enters our bloodstream directly. Given this, injectable drugs and implantable medical devices that come in contact with our bloodstream are tested for the presence of endotoxin with a test made from the blood of the horseshoe crab, which has shown remarkable sensitivity to the presence of these toxins. Most of the global pharmaceutical biomedical industry uses a test made from the Limulus horseshoe crab species called Limulus amoebocyte lysate, or LAL. However, in some parts of Asia, particularly in China, the Tachypleus species is used for a comparable endotoxin test called Tachypleus amoebocyte lysate, or TAL. It is the unsustainable harvest of Tachypleus for the production of TAL that is of primary concern. We believe the pharmaceutical biomedical industry, more than any other user group, has the power to stop the decline of the 2 of the 3 Asian horseshoe crab species if they were to stop using endotoxin testing products that are derived from the unsustainable harvest of the Tachypleus horseshoe crab species. Therefore, our primary focus is the use of TAL in China, India, Russia, Pakistan, Vietnam, and Indonesia, and to a lesser extent, the impact this industry's global growth could have on the sustainability of the Limulus horseshoe crab species that is just beginning to show signs of recovery after years of overharvesting. There is something fundamentally wrong with the way we conduct business when an animal that has survived for over 450 million years should find itself in decline because we cannot manage economic growth in a sustainable manner. The main stressors on the 4 horseshoe crab species are overharvesting for endotoxin testing material, human consumption, and bait, chitin, and fertilizer production, followed by the loss of marine and terrestrial habitat, both man-caused and natural. These maps show the distribution of the world's 4 horseshoe crab species. Not surprisingly, LAL producers are located along the east coast of the United States, and TAL producers along the coastal areas of Southeast Asia. In the U.S., we have a governmental body representing the 15 Atlantic coast states called the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission, or ASMFC. It is tasked with developing and implementing an interstate fisheries management plan, focusing on the sustainability of the Atlantic horseshoe crab. A considerable amount of data generated from multiple source points aid the ASMFC in establishing annual harvesting quotas for both LAL production and the bait fisheries. Horseshoe crabs are not used for human consumption, chitin, or fertilizer in the United States. The challenge for the 3 Asian species is much more complex, for not only is its range extensive, it encompasses a host of countries with very different social, economic, and environmental priorities. Without a centralized governmental body to establish, regulate, and enforce harvesting quotas, it is less likely that meaningful change will occur in time to stop the rapid downward trend of the 3 Asian horseshoe crab species. This is why engaging the pharmaceutical biomedical industry in the conservation of this remarkable animal is essential, for they have the power to cut through ignorance, indifference, and governmental malaise simply by making a purchasing decision. So let's take a look at Limulus. After years of decline from overharvesting, it is now being managed for sustainability and beginning to show signs of recovery. The primary stressors on the Atlantic horseshoe crab species is bait harvest for the cochineal fisheries, biomedical collection for the production of LAL, and to a lesser extent, loss of spawning habitat in nursery areas. As I had already indicated, through the ASMFC and its 15 member states, we have a good interstate fisheries management plan that is designed to balance the needs of these 2 user groups. Currently, Limulus appears to be stable throughout most of its range, with modest increases in the southeastern region. However, the population is still in decline in New York and the New England states, which is believed to be the result of overharvesting and will be addressed through reductions in harvesting quotas. Interestingly, there is no bait or biomedical harvest in New Hampshire or Maine, which is the northern edge of the species range, yet the population is still in decline. Some U.S. LAL producers, who are also producing TAL in China, in an attempt to assure their Chinese customers that their supply chain will not be broken if TAL were to no longer be available, claim that the loss of TAL could easily be absorbed by LAL. Fortunately, many in the pharmaceutical biomedical industry reject the notion that it is acceptable to decimate one population of horseshoe crabs as long as there's another one still available to exploit. To date, not one peer-reviewed scientific paper or pharmaceutical biomedical industry analysis report exists to validate the assertion that the loss of TAL could be absorbed by LAL under current use, much less meet the growing global demand over the next 10 to 20 years. In 2016, it was estimated that endotoxin testing on injectable drugs alone required approximately 70 million LAL-TAL units annually. A very important point to remember: horseshoe crabs are genetically diverse throughout their spawning range and vulnerable to local extinction from unsustainable harvesting. Therefore, all future harvesting decisions in the U.S. will be evaluated against the health of the population, where the harvesting is to occur versus coast-wide. For example, the modest increase in the southeastern region's population is in proportion to the size of that population, which compared to the Delaware Bay is relatively small. Therefore, future harvesting increases will be proportionate to the sustainable harvesting levels of that region's population, independent of population increases or decline that may be occurring in other regions. With only modest improvements in the population's stability and growth, and other areas exceeding stable harvesting levels, it is uncertain whether the Atlantic horseshoe crab can shoulder the projected growth of the global pharmaceutical biomedical industries. Now let's take a look at Tachoplia species. In addition to being harvested for the production of TAL, they are also used for human consumption, chitin, and fertilizer. All three Asian species are suffering from a serious loss of spawning and nursery habitat throughout their spawning range. As I said before, the challenge for the three Asian species is much more complex than ours, for not only is their range extensive, it encompasses a host of countries with very different social, economic, and environmental priorities. Although TAL is mostly used in China, and to a lesser extent in India, Russia, Pakistan, Vietnam, and Indonesia, it is a significant driver in the decline of the Asian horseshoe crab species. There are over 3,500 companies manufacturing pharmaceutical products in China, with annual gross sales totaling over $75 billion US, with most of the top revenue-producing companies being US or European. A US-based TAL producer, in an attempt to minimize the impact that harvesting horseshoe crabs for the production of TAL is having on the Asian horseshoe crab species, recently claimed that TAL only represents 20% of the endotoxin test used in China. However, another TAL producer told ERDG the percentage is upward of 65%. A percentage that does not indicate the total number and sex of the animals being harvested, the regions they are harvested from, the level of mortality associated with the harvest, and whether or not the practice is sustainable is intentionally misleading. It is true that the harvest for TAL has declined over the years. However, this is mostly due to the decline in the Tachoplia population, not the industry's move towards LAL, which is subject to import tariffs, making it 10 times more expensive to use than TAL. 3 of the 5 major producers of TAL in China are also producers of LAL in the United States. Almost all of the horseshoe crabs being harvested for TAL are gravid females brought into China via Vietnam from various sources including Thailand, Malaysia, and Indonesia. Once they arrive, they are placed in holding ponds to rest prior to bleeding. Those that die in transit or in the holding ponds are sold as fertilizer. The rest, depending on their post-bleeding condition, are repurposed for human consumption and/or chitin production. TAL production in China results in 100% mortality. Almost all of the TAL producers rent their horseshoe crabs from a single import source in Zhongjing. Consequently, most of the TAL producers have their bleeding operations nearby in Quanji. However, some are trucked to Fuzhou in the Fujian province to be bled, and some are directly bled at the point of harvest. As the global need for endotoxin detection materials grows, these modestly stable, often unregulated populations outside of China will continue to be exploited. Sadly, the best practices held as the gold standard of conservation in the production of LAL in the United States is absent in the production of TAL. TAL producers and their customers are complicit in the trade of a diminishing natural resource throughout Southeast Asia and fueling the availability of Tachoplia for human consumption by artificially increasing its profit margin. Were it not for the infusion of profit from the production of TAL, the importation of Tachoplia for human consumption would not be as lucrative, which would drive down demand as price for this delicacy increased. Of course, local harvested and consumed horseshoe crabs would be priced according to their availability. This slide shows the back room of a TAL bleeding facility, which more closely resembles a butchery. The animals have already been transported great distances under poor conditions, then placed in holding ponds, which you saw in the last slide. Those that did not survive the journey are sold as fertilizer. The rest are bled to near death, then piled in this back room to be either gutted for their body parts, with their shells dried for its chitin, or, if they are in better condition, relieved of their tails, packed in ice, and shipped intact to the food market. Fortunately, Carcioscorpius, the mangrove species, are not eaten, for they are believed to contain high levels of tetrodotoxin. As I said a few slides back, The pharmaceutical biomedical industries, more than any other user group, has the power to stop the decline of 2 of the 3 Asian horseshoe crab species if they and their subsidiaries who are doing business in China stop using endotoxin testing products that are derived from unsustainable sources. A question that should be asked: is the 3 horseshoe crab species used for the production of endotoxin tests capable of supplying enough resource material in a sustainable manner to meet current and growing demands over the next 10 to 20 years? And what role should the pharmaceutical biomedical industry play to ensure that these ancient mariners are protected for future generations? Now, there may be disagreement within the endotoxin testing industry as to whether alternative testing methods, of which there are several, are ready for prime time. There could also be disagreement as to who has the better testing platform or which test uses the least amount of resource material. There can even be an honest discussion on whether or not LAL alone can support the growing global demand for endotoxin testing over the next 10 to 20 years. However, none of this changes the fundamental problem that overharvesting the Asian horseshoe crab species for TAL is not sustainable and is contributing to the population's decline throughout the species spawning range. And as my next few slides will indicate, growth in the pharmaceutical biomedical industry in Asia is not about to slow down anytime soon. Okay, let's drill into the numbers a bit. What is most important about this slide is the projected growth from 2006 to 2016 of emerging markets from 14% to 30%, and the shrinking US and European markets. These emerging markets represent many of the same Asian countries who are experiencing rapid growth in the vaccine market, which I'll explain in the next slide. Of course, it is important to keep in mind that not all pharmaceutical products are tested with TAL or LAL. However, all injectable pharmaceuticals and implantable medical devices and similar therapeutic products are. And if we add the R&D phase of the product development to the equation, it represents a considerable share of the market. Although vaccines are a small segment of the global pharmaceutical market, they represent the fastest growing segment of this industry and are heavily reliant upon endotoxin testing. Many vaccines are inherently pyrogenic and exempt from pyrogen testing. However, the majority are tested to determine the endotoxin content of the vaccine. According to the World Health Organization, the vaccine market's projected growth over the next 15 years is 10 to 15% annually, versus 5 to 7% for pharmaceuticals. And these figures do not include the rapidly growing veterinarian vaccine market. So why is the demand for vaccines expected to grow so rapidly? To start, the United Nations reports that the world population will grow approximately 30% over the next 30 years, from 7 billion today to 10 billion in 2045. China, with the world's largest population and 17 million newborn babies each year, is the world's largest vaccine producer, producing more than 1 billion vaccine doses annually. The other part of the equation is emerging markets, which I'll talk about in the next slide. The driving force behind the increase in pharmaceutical biomedical use as a whole is emerging markets, defined as the percentage of growth into the 5K or above income bracket. These individuals now have access to medical services previously unavailable to them. As you can see in this slide, China's income growth by this matrix dwarfs all other emerging markets combined. You will also notice that both China and India have considerable room to grow. These emerging markets will consume more than half of the medicines used globally, consistent with the more than half of the world's population who live there. There is a growing trend to outsource product manufacturing to these emerging markets, which makes good economic sense. However, China's emerging market is still dependent upon TAL, derived from 2 of the 3 Asian horseshoe crab species that are in serious decline. LAL and alternative endotoxin testing methods can be imported and used in China. However, they are subject to import tariffs, making them more expensive to use by a factor of 10. Consequently, TAL will remain the test of choice. At some point, After Tachyplea's population has sufficiently declined throughout Southeast Asia, the cost of producing TAL will come into line with the artificially elevated cost of LAL and alternatives. However, by then, the damage to the Asian horseshoe crab population could be extensive. As I just indicated, the driving force behind the increase in pharmaceutical biomedical use as a whole is emerging markets defined as the percentage of growth into the 5K or above income bracket. This slide further delineates the scope of this growth. The green represents global middle class growth, while the orange shows Asia-Pacific middle class growth. This region is the fastest growing emerging market in the world, and by 2030, the Asian Pacific middle class is projected to make up 66% of the global middle class, a 38% increase. This means that in just this region alone, 2.7 billion more people will have access to medical care and vaccinations. Even if one was not concerned about their role in the decline of a species that has survived for 450 million years, and was satisfied to shift production needs from the declining Tachyplea species to Limulus, which is just beginning to show signs of recovery from years of overharvesting, there is still the question of whether LAL alone can keep pace with this rapidly growing global market. To date, not one peer-reviewed scientific paper or pharmaceutical biomedical industry analysis report exists to validate the assertion that the loss of TAL could be absorbed by LAL under current use, much less meet the growing global demand over the next 10 to 20 years. So, what should we do? 1. Petition the 3,500 companies manufacturing pharmaceutical products in China and their parent companies in the United States and Europe to sign a pledge stating that they will stop using endotoxin tests made from Tachypleas, which is contributing to the species' decline, and will modify their supply chain policy to exclude vendors who do not produce endotoxin testing materials in a sustainable manner. We should also ask these companies to join ERDG's web-based list of sustainable and responsible purchasers of endotoxin test materials, so that others may follow their example. 2. Lobby the Chinese regulatory agencies to remove the import tariffs on LAL and alternatives. This will remove the financial obstacle for those willing to become conservation partners of this remarkable mariner through a simple purchasing decision, i.e. LAL and/or alternatives over TAL. 3rd, lobby the Chinese regulatory agencies to pass and/or enforce legislation that prohibits the import of horseshoe crabs from countries that do not have enforced sustainable harvesting quotas. And last, lobby the governments of Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, and Vietnam to pass sustainable harvesting quotas for horseshoe crabs. I know this will not be easy, but we are committed and are growing in number, and I am confident that if we work together, we can get this done. If you're interested, you can learn more about ERDG's conservation initiatives and how you can help on our website at www.horseshoecrab.org or follow us on our Facebook page. Thank you very much for your time.